Let us now go to the next very important, very interesting model. This is also a kind of an advanced model, which is called transactional model of communication. The transaction model of communication diverges significantly from both the previous models. That means the earlier models, they have some major aspects talking only about the sender and the receiver. But this is also talking about the conceptualization of a communication, the role of a sender, the role of a receiver, and the impact of context. It is initiated somewhere in 1970, and in this transactional model of communication describes the act of communicating as a two-way interactive process. This model is useful for analyzing communication in social relations, cultural context, and many other interpersonal contexts also. So the concept of transactional communication can most effectively be illustrated by reference of two different models, and there are two different theories about this particular model. So when we are looking at the sender and the receiver, here in this case, receiver interprets the sender's response as a sender's own message. A very similar theory, which is also considered as the sub-model of this, which is called the helix model, which was proposed by Dance, is yet another evidence of a model that demonstrates communication to be continuous, dynamic, evolutionary, and non-linear in nature. So the transaction model of communication describes communication as a process through which communicators create social realities in a variety of social relations, cultural context, or maybe interpersonal context. The definition of this particular communication is based on the idea that communication is a process through which communicators create social realities. It is opposed to the only sharing messages with one another. It nurses in this model that the conversation with one another and others in order to develop a communities. That means this is not very much a kind of a linear, this is almost in opposite to the linear model. They speak in order to form ties with one another, intercultural alliances and notions of themselves. To put it another way, rather than debating the realities of the experiences, you really create them by the language you use. The sender and the recipient responsibilities in the transaction model of communication are substantially distinct from those in other models of communication. So instead of being referred to as the senders and receivers, people who take part in communication exchange are referred to as communicators. That means the onus is equal on both the sides, both the parties. In contrast to the interaction model, which argues that participants take turn acting as both the sender and the receiver, the transaction model holds that you, the participant, are both the sender and the receiver at the same time. For instance, when you first meet a client, you are verbally identifying yourself and explain why you are there. You will then ask client if they have any questions. The customer is giving you a non-verbal response even before you have finished your introduction. So before you have even completed talking vocally, you start picking up on the client's non-verbal cues, and you also try to make sense of what they mean. So instead, you are paying attention to the client's non-verbal indicators while also maintaining the verbal communication with the client. So this is an essential component of strategy since it elucidates the various ways in which you might adjust your message. Another example, while you are communicating verbally, you have the ability to adapt your delivery to the messages in response to the non-verbal cues that the other person you are communicating with, which is simultaneously providing you the non-verbal cues. Furthermore, the transaction model integrates a more in-depth understanding of the surrounding context and other parallel systems. So according to interaction mode or model the impact of a given situation, both physical and psychological, either facilitate or impede communication. This model's primary focus is on the sending and receiving of the messages, despite the fact that the before mentioned considerations are also important, because it describes communication as a force that can influence your experiences both before and after the particular context take place. The transaction model of communication needs to take into consideration contextual aspects that are not related to a single encounter. So, in order to accomplish this, the transaction model takes into account the ways in which social and cultural context shape and affect the communication exchanges.